If I can feed you, let me stay. Just until the baby comes.
By the time she left town on a Friday, the baby had been still since morning. Not wrong still. Just tired. The way babies went quiet when their mothers had nothing left in them. The first door closed before she finished speaking. The second woman gave her a coin without opening the screen all the way. The third house stayed quiet long enough for her to hear the bolts slide into place from inside. After that she stopped knocking. By the time the orchard gate appeared through the trees, the light was going and her feet had gone past hurting into something quieter. She pushed the gate open with one hand. Her bag was in the other. The smell reached her before anything else. Sweetness. Then the sourness underneath. Rotting peaches. Hundreds of them split open on the ground beneath the trees. Others already dark and sinking into the dirt. She had been a cook for 11 years. She knew what it meant when a harvest went untended. She knew what it cost. A man sat on the porch. He was not reading, not working. Just sitting the way a person sits when sitting has become the thing they do instead of everything else. She looked at the fruit on the ground. She looked at him. "You are losing your winter stock," she said. His eyes lifted to her. To the bag in her hand. To the coat stretched tight across her stomach. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she said quietly, "I can save what is left." The wind moved through the trees. "Preserve it. Dry it. Cook through winter." Still nothing from him. She tightened her fingers around the handle of the bag. "If you let me stay until the baby comes." He looked at her a long time after that. Not cruel. Not kind either. Just tired. Finally, he said there was nothing available there. She should try town. Her eyes dropped briefly toward the orchard road behind her. Then back to him. She did not say she already had. After a moment, she nodded once and walked past the house toward the storage shed near the trees. The door stuck halfway before opening. Inside were empty crates. Old shelves. Dust, a stack of forgotten jars in one corner. But it was dry. That was enough. She moved 2 crates aside and laid her coat on the floorboards. The baby shifted once when she lowered herself down. Her whole back burned from the walk. She curled onto her side with the bag against her stomach. Outside, peaches kept falling softly through the dark. He found her before sunrise. The lantern inside the shed was already lit. She had been working. Good fruit in one crate. Spoiled fruit in another. Bruised peaches separated carefully into their own pile for preserves. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, despite the cold. She did not look up when he stopped in the doorway. "About 40% is still good," she said. "Maybe more underneath." Her hands kept moving as she spoke. "If we start now." He looked at the sorted crates. At the work already done before daylight. Then at the coat folded in the corner where she had slept. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then he turned and walked back toward the house. She listened to his steps disappear across the yard. A few minutes later, she heard another door open inside the house. Then movement. Boxes dragged across a floor. Something set down in the hall. She kept sorting peaches. When her fingers finally went stiff from cold, she carried the usable crates toward the kitchen entrance. The room beside it stood open. A narrow bed against the wall. Clean blanket folded flat. The old boxes gone. She stopped in the doorway. The room smelled faintly of dust and cedarwood. No one was there. Her eyes moved slowly across the empty drawers beside the bed. Then down to the bag in her hand. After a moment, she set the bag beside the bed frame. Still closed. She straightened carefully, one hand pressing against the ache in her lower back. Then she walked into the kitchen and knelt beside the stove. The wood caught slowly. The first warmth spread through the room in thin waves. The house sounded different with someone in it again. He noticed it before he meant to. The scrape of a spoon against a pot. Cabinet doors opening. Water poured into something metal. For 8 months, the house had mostly sounded empty. Since spring, he had been eating whatever required the least effort. Bread from town. Cold meat. Coffee left too long on the stove. The kitchen had belonged to his mother. After she died, he stopped sitting at the table because the silence there felt worse than working through supper. That morning, the smell of coffee reached him before he opened his bedroom door. He stood in the hallway listening for a moment. Then he walked to the kitchen. She was at the stove with her back to him. Steam lifted from a pot near her arm. Damp strands of hair had come loose around her neck from the heat. She reached for another jar without turning, then paused. A moment later, she set a cup on the table behind her, not looking at him, just placing it there because someone was standing in the room. He looked at the cup, then at the chair beside it. Slowly he sat down. The coffee was still hot. Outside the windows, the orchard sat gray beneath the early morning fog. Inside, the stove crackled softly while she worked. Neither of them spoke. That evening, he came back before dark. He did not realize it until he stepped inside and warmth hit him from the kitchen. Something was cooking. Not just food. A real meal. The smell reached him halfway down the hall. He hung his coat by the door. She set a plate on the table without asking if he wanted one. He sat down. After a while, she sat across from him with her own plate. The lamp between them burned low and steady. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Inside, only the sounds of forks against plates. But it was the first supper eaten at that table in months. The cow had been restless since losing the calf. Would not settle for anyone. Even Oren had stopped trying after she kicked the stall hard enough to split one of the boards loose. That evening, he crossed the yard and saw the barn door open. She was inside, standing quietly beside the stall, one hand resting against the cow's neck. Nothing else. No pulling. No soothing voice. Just waiting. The cow's breathing slowed little by little beneath her hand. Its head lowered. The tension along its sides eased. He stopped walking without realizing he had. The light inside the barn faded around them while he stood there in the cold, watching. Neither of them noticed him. After a while, he turned and went back toward the house. Her lamp was still on when he came in later that night. He passed the window and glanced toward it without meaning to. She sat on the edge of the bed with the bag open beside her. Tiny clothes folded carefully across her lap. A pair of socks no bigger than his hand. She folded each piece slowly, smoothed the fabric flat with her fingers, then placed everything back inside the bag, one piece at a time. The drawers beside the bed stayed empty. When she finished, she closed the bag and set it back on the floor within reach, as though she might need to leave quickly. He stood there a moment longer than he should have. Then he walked quietly to the kitchen. The jars she had finished that day lined the shelf beside the stove. 14 of them. More preserves than the orchard had put up the entire previous autumn. He stood in the dark, looking at them. Then at the faint light still burning beneath her door down the hall. And for the first time in months, the house no longer felt empty. The shelves filled slowly, one jar at a time. By the time he came in from the morning chores, the stove was already hot and the kitchen windows had fogged from steam. She would be standing at the counter with her sleeves rolled back, moving between the pot and the jars while the smell of cooked fruit drifted through the house. Sometimes pear, sometimes peach, sometimes apple butter thickening low over the flame. He never asked how many jars she had finished. But every evening his eyes went to the shelves before they went anywhere else. 14 the first week. More after that. By the third week the kitchen shelf was full and jars had started appearing in the storage room beside the old crates. The orchard no longer smelled like fruit dying on the ground. It smelled like winter being prepared for. She moved more carefully now. Not slower. Just differently. One hand against the counter before turning. A pause halfway down the porch steps. The baby sat low enough now that standing too long tightened something across her back and left her breath shorter by evening. She adjusted without speaking about it. If stirring took time, she dragged the low stool beside the stove. If something was heavy, she found another way to move it. Most days he pretended not to notice. One morning he came in from the barn and found her reaching for the large preserving pot on the high shelf. She was stretched onto her toes, trying not to pull at her back. Before she could reach it, he crossed the kitchen, lifted the pot down, and set it beside her. Then he walked to the sink to wash his hands as though that had been the reason he crossed the room. She looked at the pot, then at him. But he was already reaching for his gloves by the door. A moment later she pulled the pot toward herself and started cutting fruit. The buyer came through on a Wednesday. Older man. Gray coat, dusty from the road. He walked slowly through the storage room while Luke stood near the door. His fingers moved over the labels on the jars. Peach preserve. Pear butter. Dried apple. He picked one up and held it toward the light. Thought this place stopped putting up stock like this after your mother passed, he said. Luke looked at the shelves. For a second he said nothing. Then quietly, so did I. The buyer nodded once. Before leaving he doubled the winter order from the previous year. After the horse disappeared down the road, Luke stayed in the storage room a while. The shelves were nearly full now. Rows of jars catching the afternoon light through the small window. He stood there looking at them. Then he walked back to the kitchen. She was at the counter kneading dough. A strand of hair had slipped loose against her cheek from the heat. Flour dusted her sleeves. She did not know about the order. Did not know what the buyer had said. He stood in the doorway a moment, then went back outside. By the second week the cow had stopped fighting the milking. The first few mornings she still turned her head sharply at every movement. Watching. Waiting. But the woman's hand stayed calm against her. No sudden pulling. No loud voice. Just steady pressure and patience. After a while the animal stopped checking. Milk started appearing in the kitchen beside the jars. Cream cooling in shallow pans near the window. Butter wrapped in cloth. Soft cheese set carefully on the shelf to firm in the cold. None of it announced. It simply became part of the house little by little. Orrin noticed first. He came in from the orchard one afternoon and stopped in front of the shelves. He picked up one of the small rounds of cheese and turned it once in his hand before setting it back carefully where he found it. At supper he removed his hat near the door instead of keeping it on. Before leaving that evening he paused near the kitchen. "Ma'am," he said with a small nod. Then he stepped back outside. After that he started wiping his boots before entering the house. The porch step got fixed sometime during the night. She noticed it the next morning carrying wood inside. The cracked board she'd been stepping around for days had been replaced cleanly enough the repair barely showed. New nails. Fresh cut wood. Solid beneath her feet. She stood there a second looking toward the barn. Then kept walking. That Friday morning there was stacked firewood outside her room. Enough for several cold nights. Neatly split. Covered against snow with a piece of canvas. She stood in the doorway holding the empty wood basket and looked at it a while. At supper she set his plate down in front of him. Then, after a small hesitation, she sat across from him with her own. The lamp burned low between them. Neither mentioned the wood. But she stayed at the table until both of them had finished eating. She woke sometime after midnight with the baby pressing hard enough against her ribs to make sleep impossible. The house was dark and quiet. She wrapped her shawl around herself and went slowly to the kitchen. The stove had burned low, but the room still held warmth. She lit the small lamp on the table. Then she brought the bag from her room. For a long time she just sat there with her hands resting on it. Finally she opened it. Tiny clothes folded inside. A small shirt she had sewn herself. 2 blankets. She lifted each piece carefully and smoothed the fabric flat against the table before folding it again exactly the same way. When she finished she looked toward the empty drawer near the stove. Then back at the bag. After a while she placed everything carefully inside again and closed it. The lamp stayed burning a long time after that. The wooden box appeared the next morning. Small enough to fit beside the warmest part of the kitchen wall. Clean pine wood sanded smooth at the edges. A piece of soft flannel lined the bottom. She stopped when she saw it. For a moment she simply stood there with one hand against the doorway. Then she crossed the room slowly and crouched beside it. Her fingers brushed the inside edge. Careful work. Measured. Built by someone who had thought about size before cutting the wood. Outside she could hear him in the barn. The low sound of the cow shifting in the stall. The scrape of a bucket. She sat beside the box another moment. Then she went quietly to her room. When she came back she carried the tiny socks in her hand. She placed them inside. After that she lit the stove. That evening the shelves were nearly full. He sat at the table turning his coffee cup once between his hands while the lamp flickered softly overhead. She was wiping the counter when he finally spoke. Oren says buyers are already asking about spring. She looked over at him. Said they want to know if production will hold. He said it while looking toward the shelves instead of her. Rows of preserves lining the wall. The room smelling faintly of sugar and spice and bread still cooling beside the window. She followed his eyes toward the jars. There was still a little empty space left near the end of the shelf. "It will," she said quietly. He nodded once. Then carried his cup to the window. Outside the orchard trees moved darkly in the wind. Inside the wooden box sat near the warm wall with the tiny socks folded neatly inside it. In her room the bag was still packed. But for the first time since arriving, she had spoken about spring as though she expected to see it. Aldous Cole came on a Tuesday morning. Luke was in the far trees. She heard the horse before she saw him. Hooves on the road. Then the creak of leather stopping at the gate. She wiped flour from her hands and looked through the kitchen window. The man tying the horse wore town clothes. Clean boots. Dark coat. Hat held properly in one hand after he reached the porch. The kind of man who entered houses expecting to be welcomed into them. She opened the door before he knocked. He introduced himself politely. Aldous Cole. Land east of the orchard. Old friend of the Mercer family. His smile arrived easily, like something practiced often enough it no longer required effort. She stepped aside and he came in slowly. His eyes moved over everything before he sat down. The shelves. The jars cooling near the stove. The wooden box near the warm wall. The tiny socks folded inside it. Then her stomach. She poured coffee because that was what you did when someone sat at your table. He thanked her kindly enough. He drank half the cup before saying anything important. Spoke first about weather, buyers, roads through winter. The orchard recovering better than expected. His voice stayed pleasant through all of it. That was the worst part. Luke's mother kept a respected house, he said finally. She kept kneading the dough. People noticed changes quickly around here. She said nothing. A decent man can lose contracts over the wrong kind of talk. Still pleasant. Still calm. He looked at the shelves while he spoke instead of looking at her directly. Unmarried woman. Child coming. Nobody knowing where she belongs. Buyers get cautious. He lifted the cup again. Not because they're cruel. Because business prefers certainty. The dough beneath her hands had already been kneaded enough. She kept folding it anyway. "You seem sensible," he said. "I imagine you understand the difficulty." He finished the coffee. Set the cup carefully beside the plate. Put his hat back on. "I only mentioned it because Luke Mercer is a good man." Then he smiled again. And left. The kitchen stayed quiet after the horse sounds disappeared down the road. She stood at the counter with both hands pressed into the dough. Folded it. Pressed again. The dough had gone smooth several minutes earlier. Her hands kept working anyway. After a while she shaped the loaves and set them near the stove. She washed the flour from her fingers. Then she went to her room. The bag was still beside the bed, closed, ready. She looked at it for a long moment. Then went back to the kitchen and started supper. That evening she moved differently. Not enough for someone unfamiliar to notice. Luke noticed before he sat down. She no longer crossed the middle of the kitchen if she could avoid it. She stayed near the counters. Near the walls. When he reached for the salt she apologized before he had even spoken. Sorry. Soft and automatic. He looked at her once across the table. She kept her eyes on the stove. After supper she washed the dishes too quickly. Put things away too carefully. Left less sound behind her when she moved through the room. Luke watched her dry the plates. Somebody come by today? He asked. Her hands paused only a second. Neighbor, she said. He nodded once. Nothing else. But later that night he stood in the barn much longer than necessary with one hand resting against the stall door, looking toward the house lights through the dark. The next morning the counter beside the stove was empty. The small jar of cooking salt gone. The wooden spoons she had brought in her bag gone. The folded cloth she used near the fire gone. Luke stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the cleared space. Then he sat down and drank his coffee. Did not ask where the things were. Did not mention it. Went outside. She heard the hammering around midday. Boards shifting. Nails driven in. Wood dragged across the floor. The sounds went on nearly an hour. When she came back from the storage room that evening there were new shelves built beside the stove. Longer than the others. Fresh tines still pale against the darker wall. Enough room for another full season of preserves. Enough room for more than preserves. She stood in the doorway holding a basket against her stomach. Looked at the shelves. Looked toward the yard where he was splitting wood near the barn. Then she carried the basket inside. A few minutes later the small jar of salt returned to the counter. Then the spoons. Then the folded cloth beside the stove. Nothing was said about any of it. Cole came back 3 weeks later. Luke was repairing the fence near the road when the horse stopped. Cole handed him a folded paper. Old debt 3 years back. Small amount, proper signatures. Luke read it once. Cole rested both hands on the saddle horn. I've waited out of respect for your mother, he said. But people are beginning to question the stability of the orchard. His eyes moved briefly toward the house. Complicated households make buyers nervous. Luke folded the paper. I'll handle it, he said. Cole nodded like two reasonable men discussing reasonable things. Of course. Then he rode away. That evening Luke came into the kitchen carrying the folded paper. She was standing at the stove stirring preserves slowly. The baby sat low now. Some evenings she pressed one hand against the small of her back without seeming to realize she was doing it. He set the paper on the table. Cole brought this. She dried her hands and opened it, read silently. Looked up. Will you lose the orchard? No. Just that. He poured coffee into his cup and stood near the window. Behind him the last light was fading across the trees. She folded the paper carefully and set it back down. Turned to the stove again. A few moments later he saw her pause slightly, one hand pressing briefly against her spine before she kept stirring. He looked out the window and said nothing. That night he heard the kitchen chair move after midnight. Then the soft sounds he recognized already. Cloth unfolding. Cloth folded again. The quiet opening and closing of the bag. He lay awake staring at the ceiling while the sounds continued down the hall. In the morning he rode to town before sunrise. Returned near dusk. Said nothing through supper. After they finished eating he placed a receipt beside her plate. Debt settled in full. Cole's signature at the bottom. She read it once. Looked at him. He was looking down into his coffee cup. She stood slowly and carried the paper to her room. A moment later he heard the wardrobe open. Then the sound of the bag being lifted. Said inside. Wardrobe door closing. The house went quiet again. Luke sat alone at the table a while longer. The kitchen was warm. 47 jars lined the shelves along the wall. Outside the orchard stood dark beneath the winter sky. He finished his coffee. Washed the cup. Blew out the lamp. She woke sometime after midnight. For a moment she thought it was the wind. Then the pain came again. Low across her back. Tightening slowly this time instead of arriving sharp the way the ordinary aches had for weeks. She stayed still beneath the blanket waiting for it to pass. It did. Then came back longer. She closed her eyes. 6 weeks early. She had counted twice already this month because part of her kept worrying she had counted wrong the first time. She knew exactly how early it was. Another pain moved through her. Outside, the wind pressed lightly against the house. Somewhere in the orchard, a loose branch knocked once against wood. She sat up slowly. The room was cold. Her bag still sat folded inside the wardrobe. For a second her eyes rested on it before she looked away again. She dressed quietly and went to the kitchen. The stove had burned low overnight. She crouched stiffly in front of it and pushed the wood together with the poker until the coals brightened again. Then she filled the kettle because it was the first thing she could think to do. The next pain came while she was standing at the counter. She leaned both hands against the wood and breathed carefully through it. Not making sound. Just breathing. Luke heard the kettle lid rattle softly. Since his mother died, he slept lightly. The house no longer sounded ordinary to him at night. Every noise pulled him awake before he fully understood why. He listened a moment, then got up. She was standing at the counter when he reached the kitchen doorway. One hand flat against the wood. Head lowered. The lamp beside the stove threw light against her face and left the rest of the kitchen dim. She looked up when she heard him. "It's early," she said quietly. "Too early." Another pain caught her before she finished the second sentence. Her fingers tightened slightly against the counter. Luke was already reaching for his coat. The road to town was useless in weather like this. He knew it before he reached the gate. Frozen ruts beneath snow. Wind moving harder now through the trees. A horse would break a leg before making half the distance. He stood at the gate 1 second with his hand against the post, then turned back toward the house. "Ruth," he said when he came inside. She nodded once. He left again immediately. Ruth arrived with snow gathered along the hem of her skirt and a lamp swinging from one hand. She walked into the kitchen already rolling up her sleeves. "How far apart?" she asked. Mary answered. Ruth nodded once. No panic. No reassurance either. Just work. She sent Luke for hot water. Then more blankets. Then more wood for the stove. Each time he returned, she found something else that needed carrying or lifting or fixing because Ruth knew the kind of helplessness that could take hold of a man standing outside a closed door. The storm thickened before dawn. By then the orchard had disappeared completely beyond the windows. Mary labored quietly. Ruth noticed it almost immediately. Some women cried out. Some cursed. Some clung to whatever hands were nearest. She did none of those things. She breathed through the pains and held the edge of the mattress and nodded when Ruth told her what to do. Between pains she sat with her eyes closed, gathering herself silently before the next one arrived. Once Ruth held out water. She drank it, whispered thank you automatically, then bent forward again when another pain came. Ruth watched her a long moment after that. Women who expected help reached for it without thinking. Women who had gone too long without it did not. Luke stayed in the hallway outside the room. At first Ruth had sent him out. Afterward he simply remained there. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall and listened to the sounds inside the room without meaning to. The low murmur of Ruth's voice. The creak of the bed frame. The silence between pains. At some point Orrin came through the kitchen door carrying snow on his shoulders. He had seen the lamp burning through the storm. Neither man spoke much. Orrin put more water on the stove. Left a cup of coffee beside Luke without comment. Sat at the kitchen table afterward listening to the storm move around the house. Luke drank the coffee without tasting it. The baby came just before dawn. Small. Angry. Alive. The first cry reached down the hallway thin and sharp and sudden enough that Luke stood before he realized he had moved. Then silence. Then Ruth speaking softly. Then the baby again. Luke stayed where he was. The hallway suddenly felt too narrow for breathing. A few minutes later Ruth opened the door. She looked tired now. "Baby's early," she said. "Very small." Luke looked past her toward the room but could see only lamplight. "She needs milk." Just practical. Just true. Mary doesn't have enough yet. Luke was already pulling on his coat again before Ruth finished speaking. The barn was warmer than outside but colder than the house. The cow lifted her head the moment he entered. She had settled in recent weeks. Not fully, but enough. Enough to let Mary near her. Enough to stop fighting the stall door. Luke crossed to her and rested one hand briefly against her neck before fitting the halter. "Come on," he said quietly. The cow followed him out into the storm. Oren looked up once when Luke brought the animal into the kitchen. Did not ask questions. Just stood and moved the chair out of the way. The cow's hooves sounded strange against the kitchen floorboards. Ruth came from the bedroom carrying the baby wrapped tightly in blankets. So small the blankets looked too large around her. Another neighbor woman had arrived during the storm sometime before dawn. Luke had barely noticed her come in. Ruth handed the child to her and told her what to do. Warm the milk slowly. Not too fast. Small amounts first. The woman nodded and carried the baby toward the stove. The baby cried once. Then again weaker. Mary sat upright against the headboard watching everything with exhausted eyes that never left the child. Luke stood near the doorway with melted snow soaking dark into the shoulders of his coat. The baby finally latched onto the cloth and drank. Tiny hands clenched. Breathing quick between swallows. Working with everything she had. The room stayed completely quiet except for the fire and the soft sounds of the baby swallowing. Mary lowered her head a moment. Not crying. Just lowering it. Later Luke sat back down in the hallway. The storm had eased some by then. Oren sat beside him after a while. Neither spoke. From the kitchen came the low sound of the cow shifting her weight near the stove. From the bedroom came the small restless sounds of the baby. Not crying now. Just there, small sounds, living sounds. Luke leaned his head back against the wall and listened to them. Ruth stepped into the hallway near sunrise. "They're both sleeping," she said. Oren stood first. Went outside to tend the cow without being asked. Ruth disappeared back into the room. Luke remained where he was another minute. Then he stood and went into the kitchen. The wooden box near the stove held folded blankets now. Someone had added another piece of flannel along the bottom. The kettle had gone cold again. Luke filled it. Set it back on the stove. From down the hallway came the soft sound of the baby waking. Then Mary's voice. Hoarse with exhaustion. Quietly humming something he did not recognize. Luke stood beside the stove listening to it while the first morning light slowly reached the kitchen windows. Spring came back to the orchard slowly. First in the ground softening under the morning frost. Then in the color at the ends of the branches, green so pale it almost looked imagined until suddenly it was everywhere. Then one morning the bees came back to the near trees and the sound of them drifted through the open kitchen window while she stood with the baby against her shoulder and listened without moving. The baby was 6 weeks old. She had been small at the start. She was still small now, but steadier. She slept longer between feedings. Her hands uncurled sometimes in her sleep. When she was awake she watched everything with serious dark eyes. The stove, the shelves, the movement of hands across the kitchen. She slept in the wooden box near the stove at night. During the day she rode against her mother's chest in a length of cloth tied across her back and shoulders while bread rose and fruit simmered and floors were swept. Sometimes she slept there too, her cheek turned against the worn fabric of her mother's dress. The orchard was producing again. The buyers had returned earlier than usual that spring. Contracts were signed before the thaw had fully left the ground. Men who had not stopped at the Mercer orchard in nearly a year rode through the valley again. One morning she found a folded paper in the kitchen drawer while looking for twine. Planting notes. His mother's handwriting. What to place in the east rows. What soil held water longer after rain. Which trees always bloomed early. She left the paper beside his coffee cup without mentioning it. From the kitchen window she watched him stand in the yard reading it in the cold morning light for a long time before folding it carefully and putting it into his coat pocket. That afternoon he planted the east rows. Oren came 3 days a week now instead of 2. Nobody discussed the change. He simply began arriving on Thursdays as well. She started setting a third plate on the table without asking if he would stay to eat. That was how things became settled there. Quietly. Without announcement. Sometimes during supper Oren would mention weather coming in from the west or a broken fence near the creek. Luke would answer. She would pass the bread. The baby watched all of them from her blanket near the stove. One morning Oren stopped beside the wooden box before going out to the orchard. The baby blinked up at him solemnly. Oren studied her for a moment. "Got good eyes," he said. Then he pulled on his gloves and went outside. Cole came one last time when the first blossoms opened. Luke saw him from the far trees and was already at the gate by the time the horse reached the road. Cole did not bring papers this time. He sat on the horse looking past the gate toward the orchard, toward the smoke rising from the chimney, toward the open storage shed where empty shelves waited for the next season, toward the house. Luke said nothing. Neither did Cole. After a while Cole gathered the reins and turned the horse back toward town. Luke stood at the gate until the sound of the hooves disappeared. Then he went back to work. She heard the horse leave. From the kitchen window she watched Luke crossing back through the orchard between the rows of trees. She stood there for a moment with the dish towel still in her hands. Then she went to her room. The bag was beside the bed where it had always been, ready. She had kept it ready every night since she arrived. Even after the baby. Even after the wooden box by the stove. Even after the shelves filled with jars carrying her handwriting. She picked the bag up and set it on the bed. For a long moment she only looked at it. Then she opened it. The baby clothes came out first. The small shirt she had sewn by lamplight at the boarding house. The blankets. The tiny socks. She carried them to the drawer across the room and placed them inside one piece at a time, smoothing each thing flat before reaching for the next. When she closed the drawer the sound seemed louder than it should have. She went back to the bed. Her dresses came next. She hung them on the hooks beside the door. His coat already hung there. For a moment her hand rested against the fabric of one sleeve before she let it go. She placed the small photograph of her mother on the shelf beside the window where the afternoon light reached. The Bible from her grandmother went onto the bedside table. Then there was nothing left in the bag. She looked down into it. Empty. The first empty thing she had owned in a very long time. Slowly she folded the bag flat. She opened the wardrobe and placed it on the top shelf behind the spare blanket. Not beside the door. Not beside the bed. Away. She closed the wardrobe door. Then she stood very still in the middle of the room. The dresses beside his coat. The drawer closed. The photograph in the light. Outside the window the orchard moved softly in the wind. She had spent months telling herself she would leave before she became foolish enough to believe she belonged anywhere again. But the bag was in the wardrobe now. And she had put it there herself. She did not hear him come to the doorway. When she turned he was standing there with one hand against the frame. His eyes moved once across the room. The hooks beside the door. The photograph. The clothes drawer. The wardrobe. Then he looked at her. She felt suddenly as though he had seen something private she had not meant to show anyone. "I was only putting things away," she said. He looked at the dresses beside his coat. At the photograph on the shelf. At the clothes drawer. "Should I clear more space?" he said. She looked at him standing in the doorway of a room that had been empty for 8 months. Outside the orchard had started to bloom. The baby was asleep in the kitchen. The stove fire crackled softly through the wall between them. "Yes," she said. And this time neither of them looked away. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Ironwood Narratives.